Okay, so as you saw from the opening on this car, it's a pretty clean little Super. It's rare that we get a Super in that has very few problems like this one. The floors are solid, the rockers are great, the inner sills are in good shape, but the only thing that's negative on this car is the motor's unknown. So we've been aware of this car for several years now because it's changed hands from one to another and nobody's ever actually did anything with it. So we're having the opportunity to get involved in it at this point. So what we're going to do is kind of a really fun project. It's not a restoration. We're doing is what's called a rolling restoration. So we're going to upgrade the motor. We're going to put in a 2-liter. We're not going to do anything that modifies the car's presence, because the thing of it is if you change anything dramatically on a car that's starting to creep up in value like Supers are, you're actually probably doing yourself a disservice. There is a rule in place that suggests that you can modify a car, but only if it's reversible. You know, that's how you more or less retain the car's value. In other words, we could put in a 2-liter motor, but the 1600 needs to be nearby. So if you ever elect to sell the car, you didn't devalue it, and you still have the original motor somewhere with it. This is going to be fun, because what we're doing here is we're kind of make this a little street hot rod, rat rod-ish kind of like effect. It's not going to get prettied up on the outside. What we're going to do is we're going to put in a really cool 2-liter motor. We'll probably upgrade the brake package on it, probably put in a better set of wheels and tires for it. Probably get it down on the ground a little bit with a little bit of a suspension improvement, but effectively that's about it. It's just going to be a fun little project the owners want, and it's one of those projects that we always look forward to because it does exactly that. It's just quick little tunable things, if you will, that the guy who owns it can enjoy it, and he can kind of maintain it from there. We'll go back and probably do the body work and make it a real nice car later, but for now it's just going to be a fun little summer blaster. We're winding down to the end of this year. So this is just going to be a winter project that we're going to knock out here, and then he'll take it over and enjoy it later. But this will be a real fun one to watch. So you experienced alpha guys are probably going to get very little value out of the initial approach on this car. But what we're doing is we're taking the 1600 motor out of this, which has an unknown history and unknown condition, and we're putting in a freshly built 2-liter. There's a couple things you should know. One, a 2-liter motor is not going to just drop right in here with a 1600 transmission. You have to do one of two things. Either you have to change the motor and transmission, or you're going to have to put a modified flywheel on, which is what we're going to do here, because the earlier cars, 1750 on back, US models, those had what was called an 8-dowel flywheel. 2-liter cars have what's called a 6-dowel flywheel. What that really means is there's either 8 or 6 bolts bolting the flywheel to the crank of the motor. So obviously we have that challenge. So what we're doing is we're going to put in an aluminum lightweight flywheel with the 105 series ring on it, so that way it'll mate up to our 1600 transmission, which we're keeping in this car. Again, right now we're really just using this as a kind of a budget job, if you will. Not that a budget really has been established, it's just that we don't want to deviate too far from the originality of the car. We just happen to have a fresh 2-liter motor that this guy owns, and we're going to use it. And again, the other thing you should probably know is if you're buying a car that's been stored or sitting around for a really long time like this one, there's something you should know. We've talked about what galvanic action is a few times. Well, the motor has that very same situation. You have an aluminum block, and you have steel sleeves for the pistons inside that block. Okay, they obviously stay in contact with one another. Now, if you have a car that the radiator fluid has been sitting inside the motor and the motor hasn't moved for a very long time, you are very probable going to run into a small snag that needs to be addressed. The back studs of the head bolts, where they bolt through the bottom of the block, is kind of notorious for where galvanic action has happened. And what that means is where the steel studs are bolted into the actual block, the electrolysis kind of action happens with the fluid that sits right there, and it kind of eats away at the block. So it's not uncommon for when you're torquing down a new head gasket that you could literally pull the rear studs right out. So this is what you do. If you're pulling a motor you should, obviously take the head off and everything. If you see that it's pretty thin walled at the bottom of the block where the head studs are at, you might want to take that block over to an aluminum welding specialist and have them build up that thickness of that base again to ensure that you don't have any problems down the road. And again, don't assume just because a car has been sitting for a really long time that the motor hasn't deteriorated, because in fact it usually has. Fluid sitting inside of aluminum block with steel parts tends to erode something. Usually you see it on the manifold, right where the steel sleevings are on the intake manifold, where the water jackets go through. You see generally where the aluminum and the steel are staying in contact with one another for a long time. There's usually a galvanic action that's happened there, and that's because the fluid has not been moving, so the activity stays fairly strong as long as there's fluid there. You're kind of creating a pathway, if you will, for that energy to get going. The other thing is if you're going to put a 2-liter in at 1600, you really need to consider a few things. Does your radiator have enough cooling capacity for that 2-liter? That can typically be an answer that you'll have based off of where you live. Up here in the Northwest, we rarely see 80-degree days, so a normal 1600 radiator is more than adequate for a 2-liter. But if you're using track day events and things like that, that might not be enough. So you just think about everything associated with the conversion of a 2-liter. You have to modify that flywheel now, for those who didn't know. And you may have cooling capacity issues, but the other thing you may have is the crossover airflow system on 1600. That's where the air box is over here over the exhaust, and it goes over to the intake manifold. Well, those don't fit on a 2-liter. Okay, I don't know how well this white powdery residue is showing up, but this is an excellent example of galvanic action. This is where the rad fluid that sits around the jacket stays in contact with the manifold. So this is the kind of stuff you have to watch out for, because effectively what's happening is the same kind of process is happening on the very back 2 studs, especially. For whatever reason, the back 2 studs, anywhere where the studs really come in contact with the bottom block itself, tends to be a little on the eroded side, and those are the things you have to be worried about. So if you purchase one of these, and again, it's been sitting for a long time, don't assume, even if they said the motor was good, don't assume the motor really is good. It might be best served to disassemble the motor and really inspect the bottom of the block to make sure that you haven't lost some of that important aluminum around the stud, because when you go to wrenching down on this head bolts, okay, so as you know, the idea behind this build was just to do a simple or inexpensive, by comparable standards, swap out of the motor on this car so it can get back on the road, and so the guy who just purchased it can enjoy it. Now what you saw so far in this video is you saw me pull the motor, leaving the transmission in place. If you have not done this a million times, then I wouldn't recommend you pull the motor separately. I would strongly encourage you to pull the motor and transmission as one. Follow the noted guidelines on how to do that. It's not that difficult a job, but the number one thing I see happen when people do this on their own and they have never done it before is don't forget to drop the center link out of the steering. You're not getting it out without that center link being dropped. If you don't drop it out of the way, you'll bend it. Alright, but again, I'm not an advocate for suggesting that you should pull the motor without the transmission. It's a job that it's a pain in the butt, is what it is. Again, if you plan on doing a motor swap, or if you feel like you're going to dismantle your car yourself, not a bad idea, go for it. But again, pull it as one, motor and trans as one, and drop the center link out. That's the big note of the day on that. Okay, so we're in day 3 of dismantling our Super project, and I know a great deal of you are probably cringing at the philosophy behind this car, but the principle in place right now is that the 1600s in this car is in an unknown condition. We have a fresh 2-liter that has actually quite a few performance upgrades on it that the owner already owned in a known condition that we're going to put in its place. There's nothing wrong with that in my opinion, as long as you always keep the original components of the car with the car in case you ever sell it on to somebody else. But there's something I want to talk about on this particular car. When we pull a motor out, we tend to do kind of like a post-pulling inspection to get a sense of what may or may not be wrong with the car. This isn't uncommon. This 1600, this is what we call witness marks. You can see that each one of the exhaust gaskets were leaking, which wasn't hard to believe because the exhaust was fairly loose on the car in the first place. But you know, these the copper gaskets, they're nice, they serve a great purpose, but we have noticed that they have an inherited flaw to them. Once the motor settles in, they tend to leak pretty good, so that's why we got away from these when we're doing our builds, and we started using our own in-house graphite, stainless steel, high compression gaskets instead. This isn't a commercial for that. This is just why we developed this. We developed this because of this problem. But what we're really talking about on this, and this is why we made a good idea about not using this motor, assuming that everything was okay, is you can see on number 4 that it obviously has oil leaking. It was obviously smoking at some point, and this isn't uncommon. What causes it could be a million things. What we tend to notice causes sometimes is the number 4 cylinder starves of fuel, which elevates that core temperature, which gets those rings too hot, which causes them to leak. So it probably had a carburation problem at some point, okay, which isn't uncommon. The rest of these are fairly dry sooted, so they're probably running at what they're supposed to be. But number 2 has some ominous signs to it. There's sand in this exhaust. So yet another reason why I'm glad we didn't use this motor, because no telling what we would have probably created by doing so. Sand. So we're trying to keep costs in line on this car, and which is why we're swapping the motors instead of rebuilding. You know, there's actual savings there. But one of the things that we're now in debates on is what to do with the engine bay. The exterior paint job of this car is not good. It's actually pretty clapped out, if you will. But the engine bay is exceptionally greasy. So this is the time in which you would do that. You would paint the engine bay, because odds are you're not going to pull the motor out again just to paint it. So if you're doing a lot of this at-home stuff, this is where you need to kind of calculate your actions, and so you don't do things twice. If you're pulling the motor, obviously that's the time to paint the engine bay. Doesn't mean you have to go on with the rest of the car, but you should at least do the engine bay painting at that point. By definition, that is rolling restoration, and that's what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to just get the car mechanically sound so the guy can enjoy it during the winter and the spring, and then come back around and look at doing the rest of the work at a later date. The car is pretty sound. It's physically fit very well, but you know, he plans on keeping it. And you know, for that matter, when it comes to Supers, I've never known somebody to buy a Super and that be their first Alpha. It's typically the Alpha you own after a couple other Alphas, because your initial instincts are that you're not impressed with them. But as you get more and more into the Alpha scene, you tend to understand that this is a pretty remarkable car. Think about this. When this car was initially designed in 1962, it had an air coefficient wind drag, if you will, that was lower than a Porsche of its time. So think about that. This was more aerodynamic than the first 911s. That's pretty cool, and that was intentional. Back in '65, when this thing first came to the States, it didn't really catch on. It wasn't exactly a hot seller. Only later did it become more appreciated what the car was and what it was capable of. So you kind of got to give it to those who eventually started to understand how cool this car was. And that's why they're pretty popular right now and becoming very difficult to find. A car like this, you know, nowadays we see them go anywhere from 10 grand for a rough basket case to, you know, something north of 30,000 for a real mint one. So it just kind of gives you the understanding and appreciation that those who are aware of what they're looking at tend to be willing to pay substantially more for them. And that's kind of a good thing for all of us that own. Trick little thing you could possibly do on your car. A lot of these early step-nose cars have, well, they all have the cardboard dashes, and they don't typically weather very well, and there hasn't really been a viable option out there to do anything about it. The wood grain ones, they flake off, and yeah, there's solutions to that, but I don't know, it's a lot of labor. And if your car isn't really a completely original car, you're kind of jazzing up a little bit, you can do something like this. We send ours out to our upholstery guy, and he uses a synthetic suede. So we have synthetic black suede on synthetic gray suede wraparound. It kind of actually is something I really like. It also has no glare to it, so that's kind of important as you're driving down the road. The glove box will be done in a wrinkle black finish, just to kind of put some contrast in there. But when you think about it, for no more than what your upholstery guy is probably going to charge you to do something this nice, it's still a whole lot cheaper than trying to source a mint condition original or to have somebody restore your paper dash that you have now. It's just food for thought. It's something that we like, and it's pretty cool, and it's pretty popular too. So let's use the hypothetics that you just found an Alpha, it hasn't been on the road for a very long time, and you're going to bring it back to life. Even if the owner says that the motor and everything on the car is fine, just hasn't been on the road in a long time, you should still do some of the basic things. One, don't use the gas that's in it. Get it out. We always pump the gas out of these cars anyway because we never want to get stuck with bad gas hitting a freshly built motor. Two, change the fuel filters. You should have most likely two, one near the tank and one up in the engine bay. Three, change the oil. Regardless of how good the oil may be, oil is hygroscopic. It draws in moisture. Okay, so a car that's been sitting for a while, that oil goes bad just like gas does. Change the radiator fluid as well, because the radiator fluid on an aluminum motor that has been moving for a long time tends to have galvanic action properties to it, and it's just not something you want to have circulating around the motor. And last but not least, also change the brake fluid. Brake fluid is notoriously hygroscopic, which means it draws in moisture as well. Brake fluid can effectively damage the brakes if it has moisture in it, and so they'll seize or they won't work at all. So either way, change every bit of the fluids that you can.